I'm Stephen Foskett.
I'm Frederic van Haren.
And this is the Utilizing AI podcast. Welcome to another episode of Utilizing AI, the podcast about enterprise applications for machine learning, deep learning, data science, and other artificial intelligence topics. If you've been listening to the podcast for a while, you've heard a variety of perspectives, a lot of which come from folks who are making hardware and software in the AI ecosystem. But of course, we also like to invite in folks who are implementing AI, or even folks who want to challenge our audience a little bit with questions about ethics and so on. The idea is to give our audience an overview, a high-level perspective of AI in the enterprise today. And that's one of the challenges I think that a lot of people have is, you see the applications that you are trying to implement, but you're not sure how that fits in with how other companies are doing it or what's going on in the industry. And but yet it's interesting to hear about that, right, Frederic?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's always good to hear from somebody who has done the research and looked at the state of enterprise AI to understand what the market is doing. I mean, everybody we talk to probably has ideas and might be working in a niche market, and having an overview would be a great topic.
Yeah, and that's why we've invited on a friend of the podcast today, Manoj Suvarna, who manages the AI ecosystems at Deloitte, to give us that kind of high-level perspective.
Thanks, Stephen, and thanks, Frederic. Happy to be here. So my name is Manoj Suvarna, and I lead the ecosystems for AI at Deloitte. And when I talk about ecosystems, I'm specifically focused on the emerging vendors and emerging partners. Clearly, there is a lot of growth in the industry. There's, as the market is continuing to evolve, and we see that there are hundreds and thousands of startups out there that are bringing in new technologies and new innovations, into the field. And so my role is primarily incubating some of these partnerships, some of these engagements, and potentially commercializing them along with Deloitte offerings and taking them to our market to help our clients realize their business outcomes with AI much faster.
Yeah, are there any particular emerging markets you see sticking out regarding to AI? I mean, are we talking about the traditional pharmaceuticals and life sciences, or is there something else going on in the AI market?
Yeah, actually, believe it or not, AI is becoming more and more prevalent across a variety of different industries and industry sectors. Quite noticeably, when you think about some of the initial adopters, or let's say the fast adopters or pioneers, you see a lot of them in the healthcare space, in the financial industry space. But what we're also starting to see is an evolution of adoption of AI in consumer and retail. Potentially in energy. Government obviously has been taking a fairly significant role in this space. And so we're continuing to see some of these industries evolve. And clearly, there is more of an understanding as well as a recognition that solutions can be automated, AI can be used in order to accelerate some of the business transformation that a lot of clients are driving.
Yeah, it must be really exciting to talk to incubating companies, right? It's trying to figure out where it's all going. What are the typical challenges you see with the incubating AI companies?
Yeah, quite noticeably, what we have seen is obviously if you look at some historical data, the amount of investments, VC investments that have gone into startups, specifically in the AI space, has significantly grown. There are statistics of as high as $75 billion invested through 2020 in startups, right? So we're talking about thousands of startups out there. There are, depending on where they are at the maturity level of the startup, whether they have continued through, that they're pre-seed stage or gone through all the way through Series F and maybe pre-IPO. A lot of them have built their technologies, and are bringing in new innovations for different domains of AI, whether it is things like data science or robotics or conversation AI or related to computer vision. And as they continue to build on those use cases and they start building on their client engagements, what we start realizing is how they continue to expand their scope, but at the same time are challenged when it comes to scale. So for example, a small startup may go and engage on a particular use case in a company, medium to large size company, but given the fact that they're more focused on delivering that technology and being able to implement that, they're not able to look at the big picture view, right? The big picture view could be, this is one project in a department, that is being used by a particular group, but there might be potential applications for other departments in the organization. And maybe they're connecting to just let's say a data scientist or just a data engineer who may or may not be directly tied in with the IT group or the business, the line of business. And so I think in those areas are areas that we foresee as potential complements for us as Deloitte, because we are engaged at the C-suite, we're engaged at the line of business, all the way down to the data teams. And so we are able to look at that big picture view and being able to plug in the right technology and the right solution at the appropriate level so that we can deliver those business outcomes. And as a result of which, these startup solutions have a higher propensity to adopt and also permeate across the organization. So clearly, we do see a value add that we can bring in. And again, a lot of these startups are trying to prove, the early MVP candidates and building their engagements and penetration as they go out for growing their business, right? Going out and getting the next series of funding and growth. But a lot of them have expressed interest that they're focused more on the technology versus the professional services, and that is the value add that we bring into the equation.
Yeah, I think that talking to C executives is a great way to fully understand the business behind AI. Now, do you see the incubators kind of working on solving existing problems, or do you feel that there is a lot more innovation going on where new problems are being addressed by AI?
It's a combination of both, and it really depends on, again, as I mentioned earlier, the maturity level of the startup, right? What we're seeing is on the business side. So, the survey that Stephen, you were alluding to earlier, so Deloitte does this annual survey, and we just recently completed the 4th edition of it just late last year, where we published the results. And this is a survey that goes out to almost about 2,900 business, line of business as well as IT executives, and it's on a global basis. We talk to companies all the way from 1,000 employees to 10,000 plus, that are maybe 500,000 in revenues, all the way up to 10 billion plus. And so we have a wide view of where AI is becoming more adopted. And so when you looked at that, what we realized was that almost about 93% of those surveyed indicated that AI is a competitive area for them, at least for the next 5 years. And so clearly there is a recognition that that AI is becoming more and more important in terms of their business decisions and their day-to-day practices. On the other hand, what we also recognize is that about 83% of them realize the value of multiple ecosystems, in most cases, 2 or more ecosystems. And what I mean by that is the partnerships that are being brought together in order to help solve the business problem, right? A lot of these companies are not doing AI for the sake of AI. They're looking at it for how do they bring in multiple different technologies and services in order to able to deliver the benefits of AI. So when you think about things like cost reduction or complexity reduction or transformation of a business or some kind of an innovation, that is where AI comes into play. And so the ecosystem component is encouraging because that is essentially what we're trying to build here as we go connect with these clients, right? Where we're in a position to help them not only identify the path to that outcome, but also be able to reinforce that with the stack that we bring to the table. A lot of these stacks are incubated through existing partnerships or new partnerships that we're bringing to help address that specific problem. right? So, for example, a solution that we might be putting forward for something, like a self-checkout, right, at a retail environment will be totally different than a solution that we will bring to the contact center of that same company that is associated with customer service, right? And so, getting that right level of, technology, the solution that is vetted by, our practitioners, and then being able to deliver that to the client all the way through implementation, right? Not just the advisory, but the implementation and the operationalization of that solution is where we spend a lot of time.
We've certainly heard about shadow AI and I guess, I don't know what the right way, marooned AI resources, where one group will spend their money and buy their own hardware and software and basically hoard it for their own use, even though it's not in use all the time. But of course, it's interesting to hear as well that the models and the data can also be marooned in a similar way within companies, and that CIOs are starting to take a look at this and try to figure out where this data can be used. But then you bring up another interesting point here, which is that not all of it is useful. So just because it's AI doesn't necessarily mean that it's useful in a different area. So if a company has multiple call centers, then sure, the call center solution is going to be very valuable. But if one of those is internal for employees and one of them is external for customers, well, maybe the data set might not be as useful. Maybe they might have completely different topics. And similarly, if you're doing like point of sale, well, that's kind of hard to use in other areas of the business. So I imagine that that goes into it a lot as well, where you're trying to find areas that you can absolutely leverage the same hardware, software, models, data, all that kind of stuff, and yet try to find areas where that really doesn't make sense. And I imagine too that sometimes you see maybe inappropriate combinations where somebody's just trying to wedge it in there because they've got it, right?
Yeah, no, yeah, absolutely spot on, right? So again, depending on where clients are in their journey of adopting AI, we see a variety of different behaviors or parameters, right? This survey also found out that roughly about close to about 54% of these executives surveyed indicated that they're using AI in multiple different environments, right? So they have two things going for them. They have multiple use cases, multiple projects, right, that they're being driven using AI, but they're also making significant investment into that effort. And so there is a top-down recognition, right, at the business level, at the company level, that this is something that we want to invest in order to help fuel our business, right? What's different in the other 46%, and even more so in the bottom list that is close to about 30%, 29-30%, these are folks that are just getting started in AI. And so they're probably, to your point, they may have a shadow AI organization somewhere and they're trying to prove out value, right? And I think that is the time when companies have to ascertain how do they envision taking some of these projects, which again, a lot of them don't see the light of the day because they don't necessarily get into a productization mode. But how does it benefit and drive those business outcomes? And that's why collaboration between data scientists, between the IT teams, and the line of businesses is absolutely critical, because if you go to take on multiple different projects all together, you are surely going to fail because AI has to prove its value in the organization. And a lot of that starts with data, right? Where data is housed, what kind of data do you have? What type of the data can be leveraged in order to help drive the business outcome? And what data, like you said, gets archived, right? The challenge that a lot of companies are facing right now is they're swimming with data today, right? But while they're doing that, they haven't even tapped into what data that they have, right? Because it's all in multiple different silos. It might be in legacy data warehouses, it might be in the cloud, it might be sitting in a warehouse somewhere. All of that data, and again, it's different by department. So data modernization itself is a path, right? Cloud is an enabler or an accelerator towards that path. And then once you have all of this data, then looking at what business outcomes you want to drive and what insights are you going to drive through that data, right? Some of those insights are, based on tools that you can apply and immediately get, like a graph database, right? Or a search engine that you can plug in. Others might be things that, as you peel the onion and as you start asking more questions, now you start digging into, okay, well, why is that pattern that, coming out in that format? And so I think there's a lot of, back and forth that needs to happen as you kind of wrangle the data, if you will. And then also making sure that the solution, or the project that you're embarking on is not a bespoke project, right? That you're able to scale, take 80% of that tooling and apply it to another business problem so that you can go, repeat the process and scale across multiple different projects. And at the end of the day, that's when you move from, the so-called starters or the underachievers in our study, as we say, to the transformers or path seekers, the 54% of the people that are further advanced in not only their deployment, but also recognizing the benefits that AI has to offer for their business.
Yeah, you talked a little bit about the survey. I mean, I'm not sure if I got it right. Did you say that 95% of the people interviewed look at AI from a competitive perspective?
It is a competitive differentiator. At least that's what they claim to have, that having AI or AI-enabled solutions that drive the business outcomes leads towards competitive differentiation and positioning. And they're certainly looking at kind of increasing that over a period of time.
Yeah, would you then say that competition is more of a reason for AI than innovation, or is that an untrue statement?
I would say it is one of the factors, right? There are multiple factors on why companies go into adopting AI. Part of it could be the fact that, so if you just reflect back on the last 2 years, right, with what the pandemic has driven, and the fact that, multiple companies, especially, and they're actually across every line of business, not just in healthcare, or financial, but also looking at retail and consumer, on how they had to retool themselves to get the online commerce going, right? To get enough, capability of chatbots and voice assistants going, because now they are getting an onslaught of it online versus having an omni-channel presence of in-store as well as online. And so when you think about that transformation that has to happen, that now becomes a competitive differentiator, because consumers are going to look at who's giving me the best online experience or e-commerce shopping experience vis-a-vis a retail store, right, or an outlet, right, and who has the best availability, right, in terms of supply and associated logistics with that. And so when you look at all those characteristics, those tend to be more in a competitive environment. If there are 5 retailers going after the same type of consumer, you obviously know who's going to win that game, because the one who has the closest experience of just as an in-person shopping is going to definitely carry a lot of that weight. And so I think from that perspective, disruptive environments, disruptive markets help fuel that competition. And then that accelerates the transformation that these companies have to go through.
Yeah, another question I have regarding to the incubators. We talk a lot about billions of parameters and hardware to process all that data. Do you see incubators kind of coming up with innovative solutions to process large amounts of data with billions of parameters? Or do you see a lot more innovation where millions of parameters will do the trick?
Yeah, I think there are areas that we see, let's say in terms of computer imaging, for example, right, where in some cases, depending on the complexity of the use case that you're going after, in some cases you need, let's say, thousands of images. But in others where there are predefined models, perhaps a couple hundred images would help at least get the learning started. And then as you infer more and more data points, you're able to build that knowledge base in order to drive inference, right? There's also limitations in terms of how much data is available in the domain out there, and how much additional data needs to be brought into play. Because of obviously, when you think about AI models, without data, there is no model, right? So the more data you feed, it helps refine the model further. There are a lot of areas where some of these incubators and also some of the established players are looking at synthetic data, right? Synthetic data that can be added, that can augment the the data in real life in order to help reach or achieve a close to the same result, right? And in order to help the accuracy of what AI can deliver. And so there are different incubators that are looking at kind of how do we bring together real-time data as well as synthetic data in order to help accelerate the outcomes for those AI projects.
Yeah, regarding to the incubators, is it when you talk to incubators and sometimes you don't see a lot of value, do you recommend them to talk to other incubators where they kind of merge their ideas to create more value? Is that something that's happening, or even sharing?
Yeah, I think when we talk about some of these startups, right? They work with multiple different teams themselves, right? Whether it's the academics, whether it is VCs, or perhaps even some of our other partners. And so, to a certain extent, there is that guidance, coaching that we continue to provide. But again, we do a fairly extensive process of vetting these startups early on, to make sure that they're able to bring differentiation and value add to both of us, right? So that it's a win-win environment. Because at the end of the day, it's all about how do we create value and help drive the transformation in a client project, rather than just about introducing new technology, right? There might be a cool new AI technology out there, but if it addresses less than 1% of the business outcome that we are trying to drive, we don't want to wedge that technology in just for the sake of bringing some coolness factor, if you will. And so oftentimes we would do our fairly due diligence in terms of the ROI that these solutions are able to deliver, the complexity involved in terms of implementing those solutions and how they're able to scale. Because again, as I pointed out, we're not looking for a bespoke solution, but something that can be industrialized, that can be scaled over a period of time. And a lot of them do realize the flexibility that's needed as we get into, let's say, proof of concepts or early builds, so that we can tweak them as we go along, and in order to deliver the end result for clients. It is certainly a win-win solution when we think about how do we partner and engage with these vendors.
On that note, I'd like to kind of follow that thread a little bit more. One of the challenges or concerns, I think, that maybe some data scientists and machine learning experts and so on have, is that the business people may not have a realistic view of what AI can bring to the business. Unfortunately, we've seen that there's a lot of mythologizing and just a lot of science fiction with the general consensus of AI. And I worry, and maybe they worry, that you go to the CIO or the CEO or the CFO or whatever and say, hey, we want to do a machine learning based algorithm or an AI system that can help to improve this function, retail sales or whatever. They might envision like some kind of talking robot that or they might think that the system can take the place of employees, and so that they can cut headcount, or there's a lot of that mythologizing out there. And I think that you are in an interesting position because you have spoken with these people directly. So I'll just ask you, how realistic is the understanding of the capabilities of machine learning within the executive community?
I think it is, to a certain extent. I think it again comes down to where the client is in terms of the adoption of AI. As I mentioned earlier, there are some clients out there who have been doing this for 7 to 10 plus years, right? That have invested tens and billions, of millions of dollars in order to drive those projects, and are well versed because they're involved in some of the co-innovation, if you will, right? Where they exactly know the direction of where this solution could help them solve the business problem. And they're working collaboratively with us, with other technology partners to say, okay, let's build this together. I'm willing to be the guinea pig in order to kind of be the pioneer, if you will, to lead this technology and lead this solution and be industries first, right, to get there. So we have some of those, and that's what we call them, to be the true transformers in an AI field enterprise. I think when you think about the broad spectrum, of executives, it really depends on, what business outcome that they're trying to drive with in the short term versus the long run, right? Because a lot of these projects, once you start going beyond the shiny toy syndrome, you have to start looking at it holistically and seeing, am I doing AI just for the sake of AI because I want to show it to my board? Or am I truly adding value to the business? Because it's not just about just bringing an AI solution. It does require the underlying elements required, right? There's data involved. There's investment in talent, right? That is a huge challenge that a lot of organizations are facing today, which is, yes, they want to achieve AI, they want to do, 100 different projects. But then when you look at, okay, how much investment do they have? How much data do they have? What talent pool they have, right? Because it requires a different type or different breed of skill sets, whether it is data science, whether it is machine learning, engineers, admins, DevOps teams. A lot of them have to work hand in hand in order to deliver to those business outcomes, right? Because not just a cookie cutter approach where, okay, I'm buying a shelf solution and I'm going to apply it, and voila, here comes the data at the results at the other end. And so we try to work through a lot of those clients, especially in that early phase, in what we go through as a strategy advisory practice, right? Where we coach them on what are the elements that are required, what are the technologies that they currently have, or what we can do to augment it. What are the skill sets that they currently have? Maybe they might have just one or two data scientists, and and they want to build this huge AI center of excellence, but don't have all the necessary people. And so we can certainly come and augment, provide advice, be able to help them implement, and also build a center of expertise for them. And so I think it really depends on what is the ultimate direction that a client wants to take. And AI may or may not be a part of the solution, right? There have been situations where we would go in and maybe it's just a simple analytics exercise, right? Where it doesn't need deep science or machine learning tools to be applied. And we're able to coach our clients accordingly. Whereas in other cases, it might be more complex than what they had envisioned. And so they might have to tweak their objectives or reset their expectations on what is real and what is achievable, right? Versus something that will have to be built over a period of time to get there.
Yeah, and there certainly is a skill shortage as well and a challenge in hiring. So I wonder to what extent, maybe your survey included this, to what extent practical reality collides with their goals in terms of investing in strategic AI approaches, and yet they can't find people to actually build those for them.
Yeah, and in fact, we're seeing a lot of that where there are multiple areas that they're driving from a business perspective, right? It could be business transformation, it could be data modernization, it could be movement towards the cloud, it might be new innovative business models. And so when you look at those big projects, we start looking at areas where AI could help, right, in order to further accelerate that. And when that happens, that's when we look at what are some of the existing skill set that our clients have, and what are skill sets that we can bring to the table, because we have thousands of practitioners that we have trained internally in order to able to support a certain technology, a certain solution, or being able to get towards those business outcomes. And then as we continue to build that, we are able to also then partner with other vendors in order to bring that skill set to our client environments, right? So that we are able to help drive that pipeline as the client continues to not only adopt AI, but also look for a long-term solution on how they address the skill gaps, whether it is upskilling their existing employees that they have, or hiring new talent, right, that they can bring in. But we can certainly help fill in some of those gaps as they plan for that future.
Right. So how does the startup become a client of yours? Are you looking and finding incubators, or are incubators coming to you, or is it by referral? How does that work? And how don't you miss really interesting incubators, right? That's missing the opportunity.
Yeah, so actually, believe it or not, given the fact that, again, Deloitte is well regarded in the industry, we have, thousands of practitioners, we have lots, hundreds of clients that we are working with. When you think about the startup industry itself, there are a lot of different ways in which we engage. We connect through, so Deloitte AI Institute is one of our eminence tools that we have externally facing, where we publish reports, we publish blogs, as well as some of the surveys that I talked about, right? I alluded to, where we do have conversations that we drive with several executives and their board members, and so some of this is through the Deloitte AI Institute. In addition to that, we also have relationships with academics as well as the VC community, where we partner with them. And some of those VCs bring the startups to us, right, to help validate. And we're constantly in that whole sensing, scanning, sourcing mode of looking for new innovative technologies that we can bring to the table. The other two ways are through referrals that we get through our own practitioners, and part of that is also because they are engaged in a client environment where this particular solution is of use, right? And on occasions we do get our clients referring vendors to us because they have already started to see the benefits, and they would like to see more of that deployment and implementation in their environment. So we clearly have a lot of network engagements with multiple of these parties to make sure that we don't miss out on the next wave of innovation coming in the space.
Wow, thank you so much for that. And frankly, I think that this was a really enlightening discussion of the practical situation in business when it comes to AI. So we've now reached the part of our podcast which when we ask the guests 3 questions. This is one of our traditional elements where we surprise them with something they don't know they're going to be asked, and we get an off-the-cuff answer. We're changing it up a little bit as well. I'll ask a question as well as Frederic, and third question will come from one of our previous podcast guests. So let's kick this off. Frederic, go ahead.
So do you believe AI products and models should be regulated by an independent organization? Think do not harm, ethical, religion, and reasons, and so on.
So good question. I think, when you think about ethics and regulations, clearly we are starting to see that, being played out in the market. When you think about traditional regulated industries, obviously, as they're becoming more and more adopting of AI solutions, there will be some regulations that will come down, right? So that, they prevent bias and fairness, making sure that there's an explainability factor associated with it. But what we're also seeing is that some of those regulations could then also spill over into unregulated industries, like retail, as I mentioned earlier, where self-checkout is becoming more common. And then how do you, make sure that you're catching the bad elements versus the good ones, and making sure that there are minimal false positives in that space. And so I think regulations is a matter of time. It's not if, but when. And clearly, there are different approaches where clients are starting to build their own regulatory bodies internally, and others are looking for best practices in the industry to engage.
So my question gets back to the question of employment and personnel. Are there any jobs that you think will be completely eliminated by AI in the next 5 years?
Interesting. Yeah, I think I heard about it, in one of the recent podcasts that I was listening to. That, there's like a stack rank of multiple different jobs which are, more prone to be replaced by machines, versus humans. I think when you think about, jobs that are more, you know, in the general day-to-day life that are more automated, if you will, right? That picking up the phone and answering. So think about voicemail, for example, right, where voicemail is able to do the job of what a receptionist would do back in the days. I think that's the evolution of technology that is continuing to permeate across across the different job roles or job types. There will be certain things that we're already seeing out in the horizon that are starting to to get automated. Call centers, obviously, we're seeing as some of those jobs get upskilled, right? So what is changing though is that rather than jobs get entirely eliminated, they're morphing into the next evolution of those roles, right? So for example, again, talk about grocery stores, right, where you used to have 15 different lines of checkouts, and now instead of 15, maybe it's a combination of 5 in person and 10 self-checkout. That doesn't mean that those 10 checkout jobs went away. They just got repurposed to other things where they're monitoring those checkout lanes, and then perhaps also helping in shelving or stocking of other things around the store. And so I think what we're going to see is more, less of job elimination, more automation, obviously, of certain repetitive tasks, but then also an elevation of those roles or upskill of those roles that will end up helping the business and helping grow the profitability of that business, versus continuing job loss or anything of that sort. I think that is what we're seeing out in the market.
Thank you for that. And now, as promised, we're going to use a question from a previous podcast guest. Amanda Kelly, the co-founder of Streamlit, has a question. Amanda, take it away.
Hi, I'm Amanda Kelly. I'm one of the co-founders of Streamlit. I would like to know, what is a tool that you were personally using a few years ago, maybe you were very hot on, but you find you're not using anymore, and why?
Yeah, I think one tool I can think about clearly in my personal life is where I was to be doing spreadsheets management of my own personal finances. And a couple of years ago, I kind of did away with it because now there are automated tools and apps that you can actually go and put in even to help calculate your net worth. And it continuously keeps updated where you don't have to manage it. So managing monthly budgets and all those challenges, you don't have to end up because it's fairly automated. And now you're able to spend more time on, less on, getting the right, the receipts and all those things put together, but more focused on how do you now make those investment choices of where the budgets are going to be applied. So personally, I think it was a valuable transition for me, to moving from actual physical work and go towards automation.
Well, thank you so much for that. We look forward to hearing what your question might be for a future guest. And if our listeners want to join in, you can just send an email to host@utilizing-ai.com and we'll record your question. So Manoj, it was a great discussion. Where can people follow you and connect with you, and where can they find more about this survey?
Yeah, sure. So I'm on LinkedIn. You can do a search on me, on my name. Happy to connect there. Also on Twitter @msuvarna. And in addition to that, we are continuing to publish results of not only surveys but also other materials. We also have recently launched an AI dossier, which has up to about 70 different use cases, depending on the type of industry that you're in and the type of applications of use cases that we have gathered or curated based on our engagements in the industry itself. All of this information can be found at the Deloitte AI Institute. So if you just go into Deloitte and and just type in AI Institute, you'll be able to have access to it.
Well, thanks a lot for that. And how about you, Frederic? What's new with you?
Well, it seems like this podcast is the right time to announce that I've been working on a stealth startup around data management, obviously driven by AI. So you can find me deep down PowerPoints coming up with pitches. You can find me on LinkedIn and Twitter as Frederic V. Haren, but you won't find anything about the stealth startup on LinkedIn or Twitter yet.
And as for me, I'm pretty excited to be preparing for our AI Field Day event, which is coming up May 18th through 20th. If you'd like to learn more about that, go to techfieldday.com. We would love it if some folks in our audience would join us either as presenters or as delegates, or just to tune in and watch. So please do reach out to @sfoskett on Twitter. Looking forward to hearing from you. Thank you for listening to the Utilizing AI podcast. If you enjoyed this discussion, please do give us a rating on your favorite podcast platform and share the episode with your friends and colleagues. This podcast is brought to you by gestaltit.com, your home for IT coverage from across the enterprise. For show notes and more episodes, go to utilizing-ai.com or find us on Twitter at utilizing_AI. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.